Today at 6, a furious political row as Greater Manchester refuses to accept the highest COVID alert level. The city's mayor and other local leaders say Number 10's plans are flawed and unfair, sacrificing jobs in the region.
This is an important moment. Greater Manchester will stand firm. We are fighting back for fairness and for the health of our people.
As the coronavirus pandemic continues to spread across the country, ministers say any delay will cost lives.
I call upon local leaders to set aside this party politics and to work with us to put in place the measures that are needed in Greater Manchester, across the northwest, so that we can deal with this virus.
From Saturday, London, York, Essex, parts of Derbyshire and other areas will be placed on high alert. No household mixing indoors. And we'll be looking at why England's test and trace system is having such trouble reaching COVID contacts. Also tonight, the Marston's Brewery's plan to cut more than 2,000 jobs at its pubs. It says the 10 p.m. curfew is partly to blame. The brand new COVID mega lab in Milton Keynes, a BBC investigation into allegations that there have been safety breaches. Italy's put on the travel quarantine list. Half-term holidaymakers could be hit after the country sees its highest one-day coronavirus caseload. Out and about after 7 months, the Queen's first public engagement outside a royal household since the spring lockdown.
And coming up on BBC News, we'll have the latest as the EFL meets to decide whether to accept a £50 million bailout from the Premier League.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. Boris Johnson's strategy to tackle the coronavirus pandemic with a series of regional restrictions faces its toughest political test yet. Earlier today, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Labour's Andy Burnham, refused to accept the terms in which ministers want to place his city on the very highest alert level. He said his constituents' livelihoods were being sacrificed. The Health Secretary for England, Matt Hancock, hit back. Any delay would cost lives. So let's just look at what's happening in England. The grey area is on medium alert, which means a 10 p.m. curfew and the rule of 6. The areas in orange will be on high alert from midnight tomorrow. That includes London and a raft of areas stretching from Barrow-in-Furness to Elmbridge in Surrey. For more than 28 million people, that will mean no more household mixing indoors. At the moment, only the Liverpool City region is on very high alert. This bans people from more than one household mixing in most settings. Now, we'll be looking in more detail about the changes in a moment. But first, our political editor Laura Koonsberg reports on a row that threatens the government's COVID strategy.
Is it too late to stop the northwest doors closing? The government wants Bolton and every part of Greater Manchester in a limited lockdown. Pubs and bars shut, travel restrictions, no household mixing. But students Dominic and Connor say at college everyone's already ignoring the rules.
Even though we might be locked down, people are still going out, innit? So, like, what's the point?
Today I've been mixed with a load of other people. Like, there's no social distancing, no nothing.
Angela's had enough.
I'm sick of it.
But Georgia thinks a limited lockdown could be worth it.
As long as it curbs the stem of coronavirus before Christmas and people are then able to see friends and family around the time, that's kind of what my big concern is.
It's not happening for now, though. Listen to the resistance from the Mayor of Greater Manchester after angry conversations with Number 10.
They are asking us to gamble our residents' jobs, homes and businesses and a large chunk of our economy on a strategy that their own experts tell them might not work. Greater Manchester, the Liverpool City region and Lancashire are being set up as the canaries in the coal mine for an experimental regional lockdown strategy. This is an important moment. Greater Manchester will stand firm.
No applause from 200 miles away, though. There have been furious calls between ministers and MPs, including angry Tories. But the government's not ready to force the North West, still trying to persuade.
So I call upon local leaders to set aside this party politics and to work with us to put in place the measures that are needed in Greater Manchester, across the North West, so that we can deal with this virus and support people through it.
The reluctance of politicians on the ground to back harsher restrictions has been the concern that those who live there will lose out. Where firms have to close, the Treasury's promised to stump up 2/3 of wages and workers could top up with benefits. But a well-respected former government advisor says that just doesn't cut it.
We are looking at a period of destitution. Do we want to go back to the days where people can't put shoes on their children's feet? This is what we are talking about. Are we actually asking people in places like Liverpool to go out and prostitute themselves so that actually they can put food on the table?
But more than 20 million people do know tonight they'll face extra limits on their lives from midnight on Friday. Right across London, Essex, York, parts of Derbyshire and Cumbria, meeting friends indoors is off. For Sue Maybanks, it's yet more time home alone.
Well, I haven't seen anybody inside my flat since March. It's lonely. So that's why I come out, chat to friends, outside in the fresh air. What else can you do?
Martin says his dry cleaning business is already on its knees.
We're in Tier 1 and business is completely dead. Look at it. If we go to Tier 2, I don't think it'll make much difference anyway.
And Bajina worries about more time indoors with the kids.
I had her at home with me for 6 months, which was so hard to keep her entertained.
Unlike his counterparts in the north of England, the London mayor had been pushing for tighter rules.
The virus is spreading rapidly in every corner of our city. Nobody wants to see more restrictions, but this is deemed to be necessary in order to protect Londoners. I must warn Londoners that we've got a difficult winter ahead.
Downing Street wants to push and pull different parts of the country in and out of limited lockdowns to match the spread of the disease. But those differences mean a clash, a war of words at least, between national and local leaders. But in the end, it's Number 10 that has the power to impose tighter rules. But remember, the Tories want to keep their newfound friends in the north. There is no easy way out for either side. And while the Health Secretary says tonight this is party political, in truth it's much bigger than that. There are some Conservative MPs, including some quite senior ones, who think that the government is making a mistake to push on with this. They're asking them to rethink. And remember too that Boris Johnson made history with his huge majority by charging into territory in northern England that hadn't been held by Tories before. And the political risk here is this looks like not a battle between Labour and the Conservatives on either side, but also a battle between North and South. Now, ministers want to press on because they think this is the best way of trying to protect people's health and slow the spread of the disease. But they have the power to do so. But they could take a big political knock if they choose to use it.
Laura, thank you very much. Last night I talked about a patchwork of restrictions across the country. Let's just remind ourselves where we stand. At the moment it looks like this, with large parts of the country in grey, still under the lowest level of COVID alert. From midnight tomorrow, people living in London, Essex, Elmbridge in Surrey, Barrow in Furness, York, North East Derbyshire, Chesterfield and Erewash will move from medium to high alert. That means no household mixing indoors and the rule of 6 applies outside. 9 million people will be affected by the changes in London alone. Our special correspondent Lucy Manning has been talking to some of them.
London's ability to meet up, drink up and to eat out has already been limited. Theatres shut, nightclubs closed, pubs finishing early. And now 9 million Londoners facing more restrictions.
We've only got a small garden here.
Lauren Johns owns a pub in Hackney in East London. Her area has some of the capital's highest COVID rates. She's now scared what direction her business will go in.
We already had to reduce our capacity massively to allow for social distancing. And then the 10 p.m. curfew, that's cut trade by about 25%. As then now this, not allowing households to mix indoors, it's just a triple whammy. we've got such restrictions on us now, but no financial backing from the government unless we're forced to close, but that won't happen until the next year.
Nearby, Ebony Ferguson and her 4 children can look out over London, but worry, like many in the city without gardens, how they'll see relations. Now facing the same problems as many have in parts of the north for months.
My eldest is autistic and partially sighted, and he sees his nana every weekend. So that's a break in his pattern, so he's going to struggle with that. I don't think their nana's going to be able to be outside. It's too cold for her.
But half an hour's drive from Hackney over the River Thames, most of the areas in South London have lower rates of COVID cases. Some here don't think all of London should be stopped from mixing inside with other households.
But politicians are adamant the new restrictions must go across the whole of London because they say Londoners don't work and socialise and live in the same places, and that COVID cases are going up across every borough in the city.
In Southwark by Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, the area only has nearly half the rate of COVID cases compared to London's worst areas. Unfortunately, the stage is set for more job losses.
We'll see by the end of October, yes, I think we will have lost 120 staff. And we've got people who've been working with us for 10 years who've been made redundant, so it's breaking the heart of everyone. I don't think we're going to see a London nightlife until the vaccine is arrived.
Friends enjoy their last drink for a while. They won't be able to meet inside from Saturday, and autumn outside isn't appealing.
Pandemics are real. To be honest, we've lived through a lot worse things, you know. We can get through this. I feel like people just need to be safe, stay at home and just follow the restrictions that are in place.
Harder for pubs and restaurants, tougher for families, difficult for friends. Like Leeds, like Birmingham and elsewhere, this will now be life in London. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
The latest official data shows 7 out of 10 of the local authorities worst affected for coronavirus infections are in the north of England, but only the Liverpool City region is on very high alert. That means no mixing of households indoors or outdoors in private gardens and most other venues. Pubs and bars will close unless they provide what's called a substantial meal. Those restrictions are still not in place in Lancashire, but some think they should be. Our special correspondent Ed Thomas has spent the day in Burnley, which has seen one of the biggest surges in the UK in recent weeks.
The waiting, the uncertainty. What next for Burnley?
Normally on Thursday, I remember, we was very, very busy. Completely we go in quiet. Even I can see from outside the town is quiet.
It's not doing Star and Dylan any favours.
At the moment, the business-wise, we are getting quiet.
And we are losing money because we got a lot of bills to pay, we got rent to pay. Day like this, we're supposed to like 3-4 staffs working in here. Me and my mate, we've been really quiet. Like literally, we've been sat here doing nothing.
Council leaders in Lancashire are in talks with the government. The most severe COVID alert level is almost certainly coming, but as cases rise, so too the frustration.
I'm fed up of it, to be honest. I'm fed up of hearing about it. It's boring mess.
I'm outraged. My children, they've had to isolate, they've been tested, they are negative, they've gone back to school. 2 days later, another child has been positive, so she's come back home again for 2 weeks. This is ridiculous.
And down the road, the bridge is still serving.
They seem to be playing politics with people's livelihoods.
But there's constant worry for Simon.
We're all waiting on a tender up to see if our industry is going to be shut down while they just fight it out about how much money they're going to get. It won't make a difference. You need a full lockdown.
I had to go on benefits. I've never been on benefit. I've been working since I was 13 years old.
Avisha lost her job as an estate agent in the first lockdown. She's 24 and still out of work.
So they basically just said, because of COVID, they have to let staff go, and I still had my bills to pay for. So yeah, it's just a massive hit for me.
What are your options?
To move away.
That's what you're doing?
To move away and find a new future for myself, really.
But there's another upsetting reality.
We're the 4th highest in the country at the moment. Neighbouring practices, over 50 cases in a week. It's ripping through the terraced housing. There's nothing we can do to stop it.
And Dr. Mark Jobon is seeing it every day now. So what is the pressure like now on frontline services?
Frontline services and general practice in particular is significant. Practices and services are really creaking. The hospital is full. It's where it was in April at the previous peak.
How dangerous is this moment?
It's dangerous, and I'm really worried about the people of this area.
It is an anxious time for so many as Lancashire waits to hear its new COVID rules. Thomas, BBC News, Burnley.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says the country is at a critical point in the pandemic, and she's considering travel restrictions that would ban entry to people from areas of the UK with higher rates of COVID-19. She also set out new rules on face masks. They will become mandatory for workers while moving around in offices or in staff canteens. Now, the big challenge for the government is how to balance protecting lives without crashing the economy. Today, the brewery Marston said it was cutting 2,000 jobs because of a fall in business. And there's a warning that around 10,000 pubs and restaurants will be affected in London alone. Our business correspondent Emma Simpson is here with me. Emma, it seems as if these restrictions that we've been reporting on all week, they're really beginning to bite.
They are, and Marston's is just the latest pub operator to announce job cuts. It's going to be losing nearly a fifth of its workforce. Now, these are staff that have been furloughed. The scheme is going to finish at the end of this month. It's a cliff edge for a number of businesses, and Marston's basically saying today it couldn't afford to keep these workers on without the same level of government support. The CEO also saying today that the job losses were the inevitable consequences of the limitations placed upon our business. And George, this all adds to the real sense of a deepening crisis within the hospitality sector. As Lucy was just highlighting, it's the businesses in Tier 3 that will be hardest hit. The pubs can remain open, they're likely to see a drop in trade, but they won't access the same level of financial support for the businesses in Tier 3 that are forced to close altogether. So the industry is warning that many businesses will simply be unviable and warning of big job losses.
All right, Emma, thank you very much. The latest government figures show there were 18,980 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. That means the average number of new cases reported per day in the last week is 15,973. And as new cases have climbed, so have daily hospital admissions, with 730 people being admitted on average each day over the past week. This number doesn't include Scotland. 138 deaths were reported. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. That means, on average, in the past week, 100 deaths were announced every day, which takes the total number of deaths so far across the UK to 43,293. The test and trace scheme in England has had its worst week since the beginning of July for reaching the contacts of those infected with the coronavirus. The tracing team only reached 58% of contacts of those testing positive in the week ending the 7th of October. Our health editor Hugh Pym has been looking at why it's proving so difficult.
Could this be the future for mass testing of the population? Children arriving at school in Southampton drop off saliva samples which are tested for coronavirus. It's easy for them to do with quick results and is now part of a trial to assess the potential.
We know we can turn around those results within 24 to 48 hours. So it's a great opportunity not just to keep children and teachers within school settings, but also more broadly to other businesses and settings too.
That's the aim, but right now the system for testing using swabs and following up contacts in England is under strain. Ministers say capacity is being increased to ensure those who should have tests get them, but there are continuing reports of inefficiency.
And a lot of the calls were essentially repeat calls.
Martin's family are self-isolating after 2 tested positive, but they were surprised to get dozens of calls from test and trace staff.
We probably needed 4 or 5 phone calls to tell us what our end date was and how we were doing, but that's it. And so the other 32 phone calls could have been given to other families.
In the first week in October, the number of results back in 24 hours for people going to testing centres in England was 32.6%, slightly better than the week before, but much lower than in June. Just 57.6% of close contacts of those testing positive were reached and asked to self-isolate, down from 62.5% the previous week. Senior health officials say testing and tracing gets more and more difficult as case numbers accelerate across the population, and it's really most effective when infection rates are lower than they are now, and local outbreaks can be quickly identified and tackled.
The sorts of restrictions that we're seeing coming in, of course they are to save lives, but they're also to reduce the number of cases in circulation so that it comes down to a manageable level, so that the test and trace system is able to work so effectively that it will be able to find a much higher proportion of the people who are at risk.
In Spain, the testing system may be working, but tracing said to be very patchy. In Berlin, long queues have built up outside some testing centres. Test and trace problems are not just limited to parts of the UK. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
And the time is at 20 minutes past 6. Our top story this evening. A furious political row as Greater Manchester's leaders say plans to move the city to the highest COVID level are unfair. And coming up, Prince William joins his grandmother on her first public engagement since the national lockdown.
Coming up on Sports Day on BBC News, the French Open champion Iga Swiatek tells BBC Sport why her maiden Grand Slam title at Roland Garros won't be her last.
Whistleblowers have told a joint investigation by the BBC and the online newspaper The Independent of safety concerns at a coronavirus testing lab. One scientist who worked at the Milton Keynes Lighthouse lab claims staff were being put at risk. The health and safety executive has found breaches in safety following the claims. The company, which runs the lab, says it does have strict safety measures in place. Our health correspondent Sophie Hutchinson reports.
The Lighthouse Labs, sometimes called mega labs, mass processing centres for coronavirus swab tests. The government had them set up in order to dramatically increase testing during the pandemic. One of the first to open was this lab in Milton Keynes, where hundreds of staff process around 40,000 tests a day. But some of those who've worked here have told us of safety concerns, which they fear are putting staff at risk.
It's just chaotic, it's dangerous.
Julian Harris, a virologist, worked at the lab this summer. He believes cracks in the system began to show when the calibre of staff changed.
When the lab started in March, then they had furloughed academics, virologists, biologists, all these people. So they had the experience, right? But towards the middle of June onwards, they started to go back. And then you got an influx of these really young people with absolutely no experience.
He alleges the training for new recruits was completely inadequate.
These people, no lab induction for a biosafety level 2, and then they're just launched into this facility. And it freaked me out.
The work is carried out in protective cabinets like this, which remove infected air. But Dr. Harris claims in order to get as many tests done as possible, cabinets designed for one person were being used by two, a practice other scientists have told us is at best poor and at worst dangerous. And he says the cabinets were being overloaded with piles of plastic bags from swab tests.
The whole dynamics of the airflow in the cabinet is corrupted, and what you get turbulence. You might as well be working on an open bench. These young people don't realise that they're being put at risk.
Another scientist who wanted to remain anonymous told us he resigned from the Milton Keynes lab because of safety concerns.
We had disposable visitor lab coats with gloves taped to the sleeves with brown parcel tape to reach into cabinets. I know it can be permissible in developing world labs, but operating that way in Milton Keynes was just inviting litigation and ridicule.
But the UK Biocentre, which runs the lab, said safety was their #1 priority. It said we have strict safety measures in place to protect staff who are operating in a confined laboratory space. It said training was robust, recruits have lab experience, cabinets were operated by just one person with a second person observing, and that there was a choice of PPE, including cotton lab coats.
We believe everyone has the right to come home safe and well from their job.
But the health and safety executive has visited the lab. It told us it found 5 material breaches. We understand they relate to social distancing, cleaning regimes and site safety training. The lab said it had already reinforced its processes based on the HSE's recommendations. The government's target is to increase testing capacity by 1/3 by the end of the month in an attempt to get a handle on the pandemic. Ensuring it can scale up safely has never been more important. Sophie Hutchinson, BBC News.
Travellers returning to the UK from Italy, San Marino and the Vatican from Sunday will now have to self-isolate for 2 weeks. Today, Italy recorded its highest daily number of COVID-19 cases since the pandemic began. But those arriving from the Greek island of Crete from Sunday will no longer have to quarantine after it was added to the safe list. Our transport correspondent, Tom Burridge, is here. Tom, I guess as the coronavirus continues to spread across Europe, we're going to get these kinds of changes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, Italy was the only European country popular with UK tourists, George, to have completely avoided the quarantine since early July. So it's a big blow for the travel sector. The positive news is about Crete and Greece more generally if you're travelling into Scotland. But passenger numbers are way down across the board, unsurprisingly. And that's partly because of the resurgence of the virus at home and abroad and people's reluctance to travel. But I'm told that the quarantine really is an on-off switch for bookings. Recently, the quarantine has been taken off certain destinations. Airlines have put on particular flights and some of them have filled up quite quickly. And the reverse is true. Only non-quarantine destinations, a shrinking number of them, have any real demand at all. It might seem frivolous to some people while we're talking about international travel, given what's happening with the virus. But we're talking about big businesses, lots of small travel agencies in survival mode here, tens of thousands of jobs, livelihoods at stake. And the only ray of light for that entire sector right now is a promise from ministers that at some point next month, testing, privately funded, paid for by the passenger, might reduce the quarantine period from 2 weeks to 1 week and under certain circumstances get rid of it altogether. But the detail on that is still being worked out.
All right, Tom, thanks very much. Margaret Ferrier, the MP who travelled from London to Glasgow after testing positive for the coronavirus, will face no further action from the Metropolitan Police. Officers said they decided not to take the matter any further as regulations on self-isolation in England came into force after she was tested. However, they have referred the case to Police Scotland. The former SNP politician has resisted calls to resign, stating her actions were out of character. The inquiry into the attack at Manchester Arena has heard evidence from 2 security officers who believed that they saw the bomber Salman Abedi praying around half an hour before the blast that killed 22 people and injured hundreds more. Julie Merchant said she had mentioned the incident to officers as Mr. Abedi had hidden himself away in an area he should not have been. A man has appeared in court in connection with the plane crash which killed footballer Emiliano Sala, a pre-inquest hearing was told. The plane carrying 28-year-old Sala and pilot David Ibbotson from Nantes to Cardiff crashed into the English Channel in January 2019. David Henderson, 60, pleaded not guilty at Cardiff Magistrates Court. Now, for the first time since a spring national lockdown, the Queen has carried out a public engagement outside a royal residence. She was joined by Prince William for the visit to the Porton Down Laboratory near Salisbury. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell has more.
Out and about again on official duty for the first time for 7 months. The Queen, accompanied by Prince William, was at Porton Down. Socially distanced, of course, but without face masks. Everyone they met had tested negative for coronavirus.
Explosive detection capability with the military.
They were shown the latest in bomb detection technology. Machines that can detect 1/1000th of a gram of explosives. And sniffer dogs, which do it the old-fashioned way, with a keen nose and a waggly tail. And so to the subject which is dominating all of our lives, the pandemic.
And no one knows what's going to come next.
And the scientists whose lives are spent dealing with deadly viruses. The Queen listened and expressed a universal concern.
Now it's doubling itself again, isn't it?
It is unfortunately on the rise.
In ordinary times, it would have been a routine royal visit. A plaque was unveiled to mark the opening of a new building. A visitor's book was signed. Proof we've been here, said the Queen. But these are not ordinary times. It's been one of the most exceptional years of her long reign. And the fact that she was there, resuming her public duties, albeit with great caution, was a token of what, as head of state, she does, to reassure people that even with all the current difficulties, a pattern of life can continue. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
OK, let's get the latest on the weather with Nick Miller. Hello, Nick.
Hello, George. After such a very wet start to the month, the middle of the month now giving us something relatively drier, pleasant when the sun makes its way through the cloud. But even though high pressure is close by, it's not dry everywhere. The flow of air around that coming in from the northeast has brought today plenty of showers across the eastern side of England, and some are pushing a little bit further west. They may catch one this evening into the Midlands, maybe later parts of Wales, Western England, and overnight into Northern Ireland. That said, it is the western side of the UK where the clear spells are most prolonged overnight, and this is where we'll find the lowest temperatures, perhaps a little bit lower than this in some spots, so the chance of seeing a touch of frost here going into tomorrow. No big change in the weather on the way tomorrow. Quite a bit of cloud around, occasionally some sunny spells coming through, a light shower possible just about anywhere, still more especially through the eastern side of England, and from all of this cloud in Scotland towards the north and east in particular, some patchy light rain and drizzle is possible. And even though it's just a gentle northeasterly breeze, it is coming in from a cool direction, so these temperatures are a bit below average for the time of year. Now we continue with this relatively quiet weather into the weekend. This is Saturday, still a lot of cloud around, the chance again of seeing a light shower, though many places will stay dry, similar temperatures. And then by Sunday, again, we're changing the day, we're not really changing the weather. Sunshine hard to find, a lot of cloud around, perhaps a few spots of light rain. If anything, Sunday looks a little bit cooler. It's into next week. The weather changes are on the way again. We're losing high pressure and low pressure is coming back. So you know what that means? The wind is going to pick up into next week. May turn technically milder for a time. I'm not sure we're going to really notice that though, as the wind picks up and low pressure brings more rain our way. October, yes, has a bit more rain in it, George.
Nick, thank you very much. A reminder of our top story. A furious political row has erupted as Greater Manchester's leaders say plans to move the city to the highest COVID level are unfair. The Health Secretary Matt Hancock urged them to put party politics aside. That's all from the BBC's News at 6, so it's goodbye from me, and on BBC One we can now join the BBC's news teams where you are.